Commander Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold metal of the observation window and watched the alien ships floating in the darkness of space. The Zephyrian fleet had been sitting there for 3 months now, 17 massive warships that looked like silver daggers pointed at his small mining station. Their hulls gleamed under the light of the distant star, and Jake could see the weapon ports that could turn his home into space dust in minutes. Behind him, the command center buzzed with quiet activity. Dr. Lisa Hayes sat hunched over her computer screen, checking the power levels for the 100th time that day. The numbers kept getting worse. Their fusion reactor was running on fumes, and the backup generators would only last another few weeks. Ben Carter, their communications officer, kept sending the same message into the void over and over again, hoping someone would hear their call for help. The mining colony of Kepler Station had been a peaceful place before the aliens arrived. Families lived here, children played in the recreation areas, and miners worked the asteroid fields to gather rare metals that Earth needed for its growing fleet. Jake remembered when his biggest worry was meeting the monthly quota and making sure the equipment stayed in good repair. Now he watched parents hold their children close while they rationed the last of their food supplies. The Zephyrians had come without warning. Their ships dropped out of hyperspace like ghosts, surrounding the station before anyone could react. Their message was simple and terrifying. All human settlements in this sector of space belonged to them now. Every man, woman, and child would serve the Zephyrian Empire, or they would all die. Jake had been a soldier before he became a station commander. He fought in the border wars against the Krex pirates and survived the siege of New Dallas. He knew what real combat looked like, and he knew when he was outgunned. The aliens had weapons that could tear through their shields like paper. Their smallest fighter carried more firepower than the station's entire defense grid, but Jake also knew something else. He knew that giving up meant watching his people become slaves to creatures that saw humans as nothing more than useful animals. He had seen the reports from other colonies that surrendered. The Zephyrians worked their prisoners to death in their mines and factories. Children were taken from their parents and raised to be soldiers in alien armies. The lucky ones died quickly. So Jake made the choice to fight even though it seemed hopeless. The first week had been the worst. The aliens bombarded the station with plasma cannons, testing their defenses and watching how humans responded to fear. Emergency alarms wailed day and night. People screamed when the lights went out. The medical bay filled with injured civilians who had been caught in the wrong place when the hull was breached. Dr. Lisa Hayes worked without sleep for days, treating burns and broken bones while the station shook around her. She was a research scientist, not a combat medic, but she learned fast when lives depended on her skills. Jake watched her steady hands save people who should have died, and he felt proud to serve alongside someone so brave. Ben Carter never left his post at the communications station. He was young, barely out of the academy, but he understood how important his job was. Every signal he sent into space might be the one that brought help. Every frequency he monitored might carry the voice of a rescue fleet. He ate his meals at his desk and slept in his chair, always listening for the sound of salvation. The second week brought a different kind of terror. The aliens stopped shooting and started waiting. Their ships formed a perfect circle around the station, close enough to destroy it in seconds but far enough away to avoid return fire. They knew that time was their ally. Humans needed food and air and power to survive. The Zephyrians could wait in their ships for months or even years. Jake walked through the corridors and saw the fear in people's faces. Parents tried to explain to their children why they could only eat one meal a day. Engineers worked around the clock to keep the life support systems running. Security guards patrolled the halls with weapons that would be useless against alien boarding parties. But they did their duty anyway. The civilian council started talking about surrender during the third week. Peter Kane, who ran the mining operations, argued that they had to think about the children. He said it was better to live as slaves than to die as free people. Other council members agreed with him. They pointed to the empty food stores and the failing power grid. They talked about responsibility and practical choices. Jake listened to their arguments and understood their fear. These were good people who had come to Kepler Station to build better lives for their families. They were miners and teachers and shop owners, not soldiers. They had never signed up to fight a war against alien invaders. But Jake also knew that surrender meant giving up everything that made them human. The station's population before the siege was 2,043 people. Now, 3 months later, Only 847 remained. Some had died in the bombings. Others had been lost when sections of the station lost atmosphere. A few had taken their own lives rather than face capture by the aliens. The survivors grew thinner and more desperate with each passing day. Tony Baker, the security chief, reported fights breaking out over food rations. People who had been neighbors and friends now looked at each other with suspicion. Children cried themselves to sleep every night. The elderly stopped eating so the young could have larger portions. The community that had thrived on Kepler Station was slowly dying, piece by piece. Jake knew that the end was coming soon. The fusion reactor would fail within days, and then they would have only battery power for life support. The hydroponics bay that grew their food had been destroyed in the first week of bombing. Their water recycling system was breaking down faster than Danny Rodriguez could repair it. The chief engineer was a miracle worker, but even he couldn't create spare parts from nothing. Every morning, Jake stood at the observation window and looked at the alien ships. He wondered if today would be the day they decided to finish what they started. Every evening he walked through the station and tried to give people hope he didn't feel himself. He told them that Earth knew about their situation. He promised them that help was coming. He lied to them because the truth would break what little spirit they had left. The truth was that Earth was too far away. The truth was that humanity's fleet was scattered across dozens of systems, fighting other battles against other enemies. The truth was that Kepler Station was alone in the darkness, forgotten and doomed. But Jake Morrison had never been good at accepting the truth when it got in the way of doing what was right. The alien ships had not moved for 2 weeks. Jake Morrison watched them through the cracked observation window as they maintained their perfect circle around Kepler Station. The Zephyrians were patient hunters, content to let hunger and despair do their work for them. Their commander, a creature called Warcast Vexithera, had sent only one message since the bombing stopped. The humans would surrender when they were ready to be reasonable. Jake rubbed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he had slept for more than 2 hours. The dark circles under his eyes made him look older than his 43 years. His uniform hung loose on his body, now that the food rations had been cut to 1 small meal per day. Everyone on the station was getting thinner, but Jake made sure he ate less than anyone else. A commander should suffer more than his people, not less. Dr. Lisa Hayes worked in the medical bay without any real medicine left to give her patients. She had used up the last of their antibiotics 3 days ago. The painkillers were gone a week before that. Now she treated broken bones with metal scraps and cloth bandages. She stitched wounds with thread pulled from old uniforms. When people asked her for something to stop the pain, she could only offer kind words and gentle touches. The children were the hardest cases. Little Mary Williams had been sick for days with a fever that would not break. Her mother, Susan, sat beside the medical bed and held her daughter's hand while Dr. Hayes did everything she could with the supplies she had left. The 8-year-old girl asked when the medicine would make her feel better. Susan looked at the doctor with tears in her eyes, but neither woman had an answer. Ben Carter still sat at his communications post, sending distress signals into the empty darkness of space. His fingers had worn smooth patches on the control keys from constant use. He tried every frequency and every emergency channel that Earth had ever used. He sent location coordinates and situation reports and desperate pleas for help. The only answer he ever received was the cold silence of the void. Sometimes Ben thought he heard something in the static. He would lean forward and adjust the receivers, hoping to catch a whisper of hope from somewhere among the stars. But it was always just cosmic background noise or interference from the alien ships. Earth was too far away to hear their cries, and every other human settlement in this sector had already fallen to the Zephyrian advance. The food situation grew worse every day. Danny Rodriguez, the chief engineer, had tried to grow emergency crops in any space that had soil and artificial sunlight. He planted seeds from the emergency supplies in cargo containers and storage rooms. Most of the plants died because the station's power grid could not provide enough light and heat. The few vegetables that survived were small and bitter, but they helped stretch the dwindling rations for a few more days. People started talking about the unthinkable. Tony Baker, the security chief, reported that some families were discussing which of their members should eat and which should go without. Parents wanted to give all their food to their children. Children refused to eat while their parents starved. The elderly quietly stopped coming to meal distribution, hoping their portions would go to younger people who had more years to live. The civilian council met every day now, and their discussions grew more heated with each session. Peter Kane pushed harder for surrender, arguing that they had proven their courage and done their duty. He said that 3 months of resistance had shown the aliens that humans would not give up easily. Maybe the Zephyrians would treat them better if they surrendered now, rather than forcing a final battle. Council member Helen Davis disagreed. She had 2 teenage sons and she knew what happened to young people in Zephyrian slave camps. The boys would be taken away and trained to fight for alien armies. She would rather watch them die free than live as enemy soldiers. Her voice shook when she spoke, but her resolve never wavered. Jake attended these meetings and listened to the arguments without taking sides. He understood both positions. As a military officer, he believed in fighting to the last breath and never giving the enemy an easy victory. As a human being, he wanted to spare his people the suffering that was coming. Every choice led to pain and death. The only question was what kind of pain and death they would choose. The station systems continued to fail despite Danny Rodriguez's best efforts. The water recycling plant was running at 60% efficiency, which meant that their supply would run out in 2 weeks. The air scrubbers were clogged with dust and debris from the bombing, and replacement filters had been used up long ago. People were already complaining about the stale taste in the air and the way their lungs burned when they breathed too deeply. Power was the biggest problem. The fusion reactor was designed to run for years without maintenance, but the alien bombardment had damaged some of the cooling systems. Danny worked 18-hour shifts trying to patch the problems, but he was fighting a losing battle. When the reactor finally shut down, they would have maybe 6 hours of battery power left for life support. After that, the station would become a tomb floating in space. Jake walked through the corridors at night when most people were sleeping. He saw families huddled together for warmth in rooms where the heating had failed. He watched parents tell their children stories to distract them from the hunger in their bellies. He observed teenagers trying to act brave while their eyes showed the fear they felt about their future. The observation deck had become a gathering place for people who needed to look at the stars and remember that there was a universe beyond their dying station. They talked in whispers about Earth and the colonies they had left behind. They shared memories of better times and tried to keep hope alive in their hearts. Some of them prayed to whatever gods they believed in, asking for miracles they knew would never come. Warcast Vexithara sent another message during the 3rd week. The alien commander appeared on every screen in the station, his insect-like features twisted into what might have been a smile. He spoke in perfect English, his translator making his voice sound like grinding metal. The humans had shown admirable spirit, he said, but spirit could not stop starvation. The offer of surrender remained open, but it would not remain open forever. Jake turned off the transmission before the alien could finish his speech. He had heard enough promises from creatures who saw humans as nothing more than useful livestock. The Zephyrians would get his people eventually, but they would have to work for every life they claimed. The emergency beacons still broadcast their position into space, sending a signal that would reach Earth in about 50 years. Jake had activated it during the 1st week of the siege, knowing it was probably useless. Even if someone heard their call for help, Kepler Station would be ancient history by the time rescue arrived. But the beacon kept transmitting anyway, the electronic voice crying into the darkness, hoping against hope that someone was listening. The fusion reactor died on a Tuesday morning at exactly 7:34. Danny Rodriguez had been expecting it for days, but the silence still hit him like a physical blow. The deep humming sound that had been the heartbeat of Kepler Station for 12 years simply stopped, leaving behind a quiet that felt like death itself. Emergency lights flickered on throughout the station, casting everything in a sickly red glow that made people look like ghosts walking through hell. Jake Morrison was in the command center when the main power went down. Every screen went dark except for the emergency displays that ran on battery power. Ben Carter looked up from his communication station with wide eyes that reflected the red emergency lighting. Dr. Lisa Hayes stopped what she was doing in the medical bay and felt her heart sink as the diagnostic machines around her shut down one by one. The announcement went out over the station's emergency communication system. All non-essential personnel were to report to designated areas where body heat could be shared and battery power could be concentrated. Families gathered in the larger rooms while Danny Rodriguez worked desperately to restart the reactor. Everyone knew they had maybe 6 hours before the life support systems failed completely. Children who had been brave for months finally broke down and cried. Parents held them close and whispered lies about how everything would be fine. Elderly people sat quietly in corners, accepting what was coming with the calm that sometimes comes to those who have lived long enough to understand that all things must end. The teenagers tried to act tough, but their hands shook when they thought no one was looking. Warcast Vex Thara sent his final ultimatum 30 minutes after the power failed. His ugly face appeared on the few screens that still worked, and his mechanical voice carried through the station's dying communication system. The humans had 1 hour to signal their surrender, or the Zephyrian fleet would finish what starvation had started. There would be no more chances and no more time for foolish human pride. Jake gathered his senior staff in the command center. The emergency lighting made their faces look hollow and desperate. Tony Baker reported that some civilians were already talking about rushing the communications array to send the surrender signal themselves. Dr. Lisa Hayes said that 3 more people had died during the night, including little Mary Williams, who had finally lost her fight against the fever. Ben Carter just sat at his useless equipment and stared at screens that showed nothing but static. The Civilian Council demanded an emergency meeting. Peter Kane no longer bothered to hide his panic as he argued that surrender was their only choice. They had fought bravely, he said, but there was no shame in choosing life over death when the battle was already lost. Other council members agreed with him, their voices rising as they spoke about their responsibility to save whoever could still be saved. Helen Davis stood up during the meeting and faced the others with tears streaming down her face. Her youngest son had collapsed from hunger that morning and could barely stand. Her older boy had volunteered to work in the most dangerous parts of the station, trying to help with repairs that might buy them a few more hours of life. She looked at Peter Kane and the others who wanted to surrender, and she told them that some things were worse than death. Jake listened to the arguments and felt the weight of 847 lives pressing down on his shoulders. Every person left on the station was looking to him for guidance, but he had no answers left to give. He was a soldier who had trained to fight battles that could be won. This was something else entirely. This was watching good people die slowly while he stood helpless to save them. The life support system started failing exactly as Danny Rodriguez had predicted. The air recycling units shut down first, and people began to notice that each breath seemed a little harder to take. The heating system went next, and the temperature throughout the station began to drop toward the freezing cold of space. The artificial gravity would be the last to go, giving them a few final hours to say goodbye before they all floated away into eternal darkness. Amy Foster moved through the station like an angel of mercy, checking on families and offering what comfort she could give. She had used up all her medical supplies weeks ago, but she still had her training and her gentle hands. She helped parents explain to their children what was happening. She sat with people who were dying alone. She made sure that no one would face the end without someone there to hold their hand. Tim Lewis, the 16-year-old volunteer, worked alongside Danny Rodriguez in a last desperate attempt to restart the reactor. The boy's small size allowed him to crawl through maintenance shafts that were too narrow for adults. He carried tools and spare parts while Danny tried repair techniques that should not have been possible with the equipment they had left. Both of them knew it was hopeless, but they kept working because doing something felt better than sitting still and waiting to die. Tony Baker organized security teams to keep order during the final hours. He expected panic and violence as people realized that the end had truly come, but instead he found something that surprised him. Neighbors shared their last food with each other. Strangers offered comfort to crying children. People who had been enemies during the council debates now sat together and talked about their memories of home. Jake made his decision as the temperature dropped below freezing and people's breath began to form clouds in the air. He would not surrender his people to creatures who would use them as slaves. He would not trade their freedom for a few more years of life under alien masters. If Kepler Station was going to die, it would die as a free human outpost that had never given up the fight. The emergency beacon continued to broadcast even as the station's other systems failed. Its signal traveled through space at the speed of light, carrying news of their situation to anyone who might be listening. Jake knew that no one would hear it in time to help, but he took comfort in knowing that someday, somewhere, other humans would learn about what happened here. They would know that 847 people had faced impossible odds and chosen to stand their ground. Ben Carter made one final attempt to contact Earth. He poured all the remaining battery power into the communications array and sent a message that would take 50 years to reach home. He told Earth about the siege and the courage of the people who had died here. He described the alien fleet and their weapons so that future human defenders would know what they were facing. He ended the message with the coordinates of Kepler Station and a request that someone someday would come to remember them. The Zephyrian deadline passed without a surrender signal. Warcast Vexthara waited exactly 1 hour and 37 minutes before giving the order to attack. His ships moved into final assault positions while Jake Morrison stood at the observation window and watched death approaching through the darkness of space. Ben Carter was staring at his dead communication screens when the impossible happened. A tiny blip appeared on his emergency receiver, so faint that he almost missed it among the background static. His heart stopped beating for a moment as he leaned forward and adjusted the sensitivity controls with shaking fingers. The signal was there, weak but growing stronger, coming from the edge of the solar system where nothing should exist. Jake Morrison was helping families prepare for the final assault when Ben's voice crackled over the emergency intercom. The young communications officer sounded like he might be losing his mind as he called for the commander to come to the bridge immediately. There was something in Ben's voice that made Jake drop what he was doing and run through the freezing corridors toward the command center. The first thing Jake noticed was that Ben's equipment was working again. Somehow the communication array had found enough power to operate, drawing energy from sources that should have been dead hours ago. Ben was hunched over his controls, tears streaming down his face as he worked to clean up a signal that defied everything they knew about physics and space travel. The transmission was heavily encrypted with codes that Ben had never seen before. His computer system strained to decode even fragments of the message, but what came through made everyone in the command center stop breathing. The words were in English, spoken with an accent that sounded like home, carrying news that seemed impossible after months of abandonment and despair. Earth's Supreme Fleet was coming. Admiral Kate Sullivan was in command of something called the First Battle Group. Their estimated time of arrival was 18 minutes. All human personnel were ordered to maintain their positions and prepare for immediate combat relief operations. The message repeated over and over, growing stronger with each broadcast. Dr. Lisa Hayes rushed to the command center when she heard the commotion. Her medical training made her skeptical of miracles, but she could not argue with the readings on Ben's equipment. Something massive was approaching their location at speeds that should have been impossible. The energy signatures were beyond anything in their database of known ships and technologies. Danny Rodriguez abandoned his work on the reactor and joined the crowd around Ben's station. The chief engineer studied the sensor readings with growing amazement. Whatever was coming toward them was bigger than anything humans had ever built. The power output suggested technology that was decades ahead of what he thought was possible. Either Earth had been hiding incredible secrets, or they were about to meet someone else entirely. Tony Baker organized his security teams to prepare for possible boarding actions. If these were really Earth ships, they would need to establish identity protocols and coordinate with incoming forces. If this was some kind of alien trick, they would fight to the end just as they had planned. His people checked their weapons and took positions throughout the station, ready for whatever came next. The civilian population gathered in the observation areas to watch the stars. Parents lifted children up to the windows so they could see what was happening in the darkness of space. People who had been preparing to die now whispered prayers of hope and gratitude. Some cried with relief while others stood in stunned silence, afraid to believe that salvation might actually be real. Warcast Vexthara detected the approaching vessels at almost the same moment as the humans. The alien commander's confidence began to waver as his sensors failed to properly identify what was coming toward his fleet. The energy readings were completely outside Zephyrian understanding. The ship seemed to be traveling faster than physics should allow, using technology that his science officers could not explain. The Zephyrian fleet moved into defensive positions as their sensors tracked multiple large contacts approaching from deep space. Vexthara had conquered dozens of human colonies and fought battles against every major power in this sector of the galaxy. He had never encountered anything that made his advanced warships seem primitive by comparison. His tactical officers reported that their weapon systems could not get target locks on the incoming vessels. Jake stood at the observation window and watched the stars begin to change. At first it looked like distant points of light were moving in ways that stars should not move. Then the movement became more obvious as whatever was approaching grew close enough to be seen with the naked eye. The shapes that emerged from the darkness were unlike anything he had ever imagined. The lead ship appeared first, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a display of controlled energy that lit up space like a small sun. It was enormous, easily a kilometer long, and bristling with weapons that seemed to bend light around their barrels. The hull was sleek and dark, covered with armor that looked like it had been forged from solidified starlight. Running lights spelled out a name in letters that could be read from across the solar system: UES Sovereign. Behind the flagship came more ships, each one a masterpiece of engineering that represented the absolute peak of human technology. Battleships and cruisers and destroyers filled the space around Kepler Station, their hulls gleaming with energy shields that rippled like water. Fighters launched from carrier bays and formed protective screens around the larger vessels. The entire fleet moved with precision that suggested years of training and coordination. Ben Carter worked frantically to establish communication with the incoming fleet. His equipment was receiving dozens of signals on frequencies he had never heard before. Navigation data, tactical assessments, medical support requests, and coordination protocols flooded his systems. The Earth ships were already treating Kepler Station as a protected asset and planning relief operations before the battle had even begun. Admiral Kate Sullivan's face appeared on every working screen throughout the station. She wore a uniform that was familiar yet somehow different, decorated with medals and ribbons that told stories of battles fought in distant corners of the galaxy. Her eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had never known defeat, and her voice carried the authority of someone who commanded forces beyond imagination. The Admiral's message was brief and direct. The Earth's Supreme Fleet had received their distress call and traveled across impossible distances to answer it. The Zephyrian occupation of human space was ending today. All civilian personnel should prepare for immediate evacuation while military forces dealt with the alien threat. Earth had come to bring its children home. Warcast Vexthara responded to the human arrival exactly as Jake had expected. The alien commander was too proud and too confident to retreat without a fight. The Zephyrian fleet opened fire with everything they had, filling space with plasma bolts and quantum torpedoes that should have been able to destroy any ship ever built. Their weapons had conquered star systems and broken the fleets of a dozen different species. The human shields absorbed the alien attack like it was nothing more than gentle rain. Energy that should have vaporized armor plating simply disappeared into defensive systems that operated on principles the Zephyrians could not understand. The Earthships did not even slow down as they advanced through the bombardment, their hulls unmarked and their formation unchanged. Then Earth's fleet responded, and Jake Morrison understood that humanity had become something far more powerful than anyone had ever imagined. The weapons that Earth unleashed changed the very nature of reality around Kepler Station. Jake Morrison watched through the observation window as beams of pure energy tore through space and struck the Zephyrian ships with force that defied every law of physics he had ever learned. The alien vessels did not simply explode or break apart. They seemed to fold in on themselves, their hulls crumpling like paper as weapons that manipulated space and time itself rewrote the rules of existence. The first Zephyrian destroyer vanished in a flash of light that hurt to look at directly. One moment it was firing plasma cannons at the human fleet, and the next moment there was nothing left but empty space and a few glowing particles that danced in patterns too complex for the eye to follow. The alien crew of 300 had simply ceased to exist, erased from reality by technology that treated matter and energy as suggestions rather than absolute laws. Warcast Vexthara screamed orders at his remaining ships as more Earth weapons fired in sequence. Gravitational wave cannons reached across impossible distances and crushed alien hulls by creating tiny black holes that lasted for microseconds. Matter displacement torpedoes teleported sections of enemy ships into the hearts of nearby stars. Reality-bending particle beams made Zephyrian armor dissolve like sugar in water. Ben Carter could barely keep up with the tactical data flowing through his communication systems. The Earthships were sharing information at speeds that should have been impossible, coordinating their attacks with precision that suggested they were all controlled by a single vast intelligence. Every shot was perfectly calculated. Every movement was planned 3 steps ahead. The human fleet fought like a single organism with 200 deadly limbs. Dr. Lisa Hayes watched the battle through the medical bay's small porthole while she prepared to receive casualties from the fighting. But as the minutes passed, she realized that no wounded would be coming from the Earth ships. The human fleet was winning so completely that their enemies could not even land a single effective hit. Advanced shields turned alien, weapons into harmless light shows, while human technology struck back with surgical precision. The Zephyrian cruiser Voidrender tried to ram the UES Sovereign in a desperate suicide attack. Warcast Vexithara had ordered the maneuver himself, hoping that momentum and mass could accomplish what weapons had failed to achieve. The alien ship accelerated to maximum speed and aimed for the human flagship's bridge, its captain screaming prayers to gods who had abandoned him. The Sovereign did not try to avoid the collision. Instead, the massive Earth ship simply reached out with invisible hands made of controlled gravity and caught the attacking cruiser like a child catching a thrown ball. The Zephyrian vessel stopped moving forward and hung motionless in space, while the human weapons charged for a final shot. The alien crew had just enough time to understand what was happening before their ship was reduced to cosmic dust. Admiral Kate Sullivan's voice cut through all communication channels as the battle reached its climax. Her words were calm and professional, but they carried a weight of authority that made even the surviving Zephyrian commanders pause in their attacks. She offered them one chance to withdraw from human space and never return. Any ship that continued fighting would be destroyed without mercy. The choice was theirs to make. 3 Zephyrian vessels accepted the Admiral's offer and began powering down their weapons. Their captains were young officers who understood that courage and stupidity were not the same thing. They had families waiting for them in distant star systems, and they saw no honor in dying for a war that was already lost. Their ships turned away from the battle and began the long journey home. Warcast Vexthara was not among those who chose retreat. The alien commander had built his reputation on never backing down from any fight, and he would not start now even in the face of impossible odds. His flagship, the Endless Hunger, was the most powerful vessel in the Zephyrian fleet. Its weapons could crack planets, and its armor had never been breached by enemy fire. He ordered his remaining ships to follow him in one final assault on the human forces. The last phase of the battle lasted exactly 47 seconds. Jake Morrison timed it on his chronometer as he watched the Zephyrian fleet make their desperate charge toward the Earth ships. The aliens fired everything they had while screaming battle cries in their harsh language. Plasma bolts and quantum torpedoes filled space with deadly energy that should have overwhelmed any defense. The human response was swift and final. Weapons that existed only in theoretical physics textbooks reached out and touched the alien ships with gentle precision. The Endless Hunger simply stopped existing, its atoms scattered across light years in the space between heartbeats. The other Zephyrian vessels followed their commander into oblivion, their crews never understanding what had killed them. Warcast Vexithara's final transmission reached Kepler Station just before his ship was destroyed. The alien commander's voice was filled with something that might have been respect as he spoke his last words to the humans who had defeated him. Earth's children were not the weak creatures his people had believed them to be. Humanity had been hiding its true strength while it grew into something that could reshape the galaxy itself. His warning to other alien powers was simple and terrifying. Beware the sleeping giant of Earth. The silence that followed the battle was more profound than any sound Jake had ever heard. 17 Zephyrian warships had been reduced to nothing in less than 5 minutes of actual combat. The alien fleet that had terrorized human colonies across 3 star systems was gone, leaving behind only empty space and the memory of powers that defied imagination. Admiral Sullivan's medical ships moved toward Kepler Station before the last alien vessel had finished dying. Transport shuttles launched from the Earth fleet and began docking with the mining station, their crews bringing food and medicine and engineers to repair the damaged systems. Doctors with equipment that seemed like magic compared to what Dr. Lisa Hayes had been using began treating the sick and wounded with gentle efficiency. Jake Morrison stood in his command center and watched his people being rescued by forces he had never known existed. Families were reunited with relatives they thought they would never see again. Children who had been starving for months laughed with joy as they ate real food for the first time in weeks. The elderly who had been preparing to die smiled as medical technology years ahead of anything they had ever seen restored their failing health. Ben Carter established communication with the Earth fleet and learned that Humanity's reach had grown far, beyond what anyone in the outer colonies had imagined. The Supreme Fleet was just one of many such forces scattered across human space, watching and protecting settlements that thought they had been forgotten. Earth had never abandoned its children among the stars. Earth had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment. The evacuation of Kepler Station began immediately, but many of the colonists chose to stay and rebuild their home with help from Earth's engineers. The mining operation would continue, but now it would be protected by weapons and shields that could stand against any threat the galaxy might offer. The message that Warcast Vexithara had tried to send with his final transmission was already spreading through alien communications networks. Humanity was no longer the weak species that could be conquered by conventional force. Jake Morrison received new orders from Admiral Sullivan as the rescue operations continued around him. Earth needed experienced officers for the expanding fleet, and his performance during the siege had marked him as someone who could lead humans in the battles that were coming. The galaxy was vast and full of species that would challenge humanity's growing power, but Earth was ready for whatever threats emerged. From the darkness between the stars, the emergency beacon that had broadcast Kepler stations. Desperate plea into the void finally went silent. After months of continuous transmission, its job was finished, its message had been heard, and its call for help had been answered by forces beyond imagination. The sleeping giant of Earth had awakened, and the universe would never be the same.